We'll take a turn again and look at the opportunity sides of a blended world where physical space blends together with all the digital tools we started using. And of course, that is the wonderful situation that we have now, that it's not only digital and not only remote, but we now can take the best of both worlds. And where that could take us, we'll hopefully hear now from Eric Mazur, who is the Balkanski Professor of Physics and Applied Physics and Academic Dean for Biological, Chemical and Physical Science and Engineering at the John A. Paulson School of Engineering and Applied Science at Harvard University. Quite a title. Welcome, Eric.
Thank you so much, Zach. It's such a pleasure to be talking at this fantastic festival. So let's dive right in and set learning free. This here is a picture of me teaching my intro physics class at Harvard around 1990, so about 30 years ago. And this here is a picture from an illuminated manuscript depicting Heinrich, King of Germany and Holy Roman Emperor, delivering a lecture at the University of Bologna around 1230. Now, you don't need to be a very astute observer to see that in spite of several information technology revolutions, first the inventing of the book printing, and more recently the information age, education has evolved very little over nearly a millennium. And even though I have been active in education for close to 40 years, trying to innovate our approach to teaching and assessment, if it weren't for the pandemic, I would never really have realized the constraints imposed on education by the physical classroom. Now, when the pandemic hit, I was teaching in March 2020, I was teaching a course called AP 50 for Applied Physics 50, which was team-based and project-based in order to motivate the students intrinsically to study. So rather than taking the content and making the content of the course central, I made projects central and designed the projects in such a way that they needed the content of the course. So by adding a social problem to the projects, I could intrinsically motivate the students for the projects and therefore create a need for them to master the content rather than just telling them, here, learn this content, it's good for you. The team-based nature is, I think, also crucial in the 21st century. Society doesn't work simply by having individuals work alone. Teamwork is paramount. Yet if you think about it, all of education is focused on the individual, and we deliver to society individuals who have never really been trained to work with others, to accept diversity, to accept a diverse set of opinions, a diverse set of skills. Now, the course took place in a learning space that was very different from a traditional classroom, but still defined by the walls of a physical classroom. Now, there are no lectures and no exams in my course. That was already true before the pandemic hit. And if you're interested in hearing more about that, well, you just Google my name and you'll find lots of talks about both assessment and teaching. But I remember that at the beginning of the pandemic, when I think it was in a few days that we were forced off campus, I read an article by the famous author and futurist Yuval Harari in the Financial Times entitled "The World After Coronavirus." And the second paragraph of this article caught my attention. In this article, he writes, many short-term emergency measures will become a fixture of light. That is the nature of emergencies. They fast-forward historical processes. Decisions that normally would take a long time to take are taken overnight. What happens, for example, nobody would do this in normal times. What happens when entire schools and universities go online? In normal times, governments, businesses, and educational boards would never agree to conduct such experiments. And I remember reading that article and wondering, will remote teaching become a fixture of life? So that was one of the questions that was foremost on my mind when we had 3 days to move from the campus to a remote teaching scenario. And for a moment, panic struck, and I was thinking, how can I transfer online what I do in the classroom? But that mindset forces you, in a sense, to see what is happening as a challenge. And as Zach beautifully pointed out, a much better way to look at it is to ask oneself, what can we do online that we cannot do in a classroom? And I decided to tackle the problem with that mindset. And I ended up implementing a couple of crucial differences, which I'm going to explain in a little bit more detail. The first one is to minimize any synchronous and instructor-paced activity. More about that in just a second. The second was to try to personalize instruction. Let me take each of these individually before I get to the last major change I made. So first, minimizing synchronous and instructor-paced activities. Traditionally, most of education has been, and still is to a large degree, synchronous, meaning everybody is together at the same time. That's a byproduct of the physical classroom. If you have a physical classroom, if you have a campus with physical classrooms, you need to book that classroom and then bring the instructor and the students together in that space at the same time. But even more than just being synchronous, it's also typically instructor-paced, meaning it's the instructor who sets the pace at which the students go through the educational material. In a sense, we're treating education as a conveyor belt where the students are all learning at exactly the same pace, even though we know that different people don't learn at the same pace. So, for example, if you think of a lecture, which even now in the 21st century seems to be the dominant mode of education, a lecture is both synchronous and instructor-paced. Now, of course, you can record the lecture, and in that case, it becomes asynchronous and instructor-paced. A laboratory, either a language lab or a natural sciences lab, is synchronous. Students need to be at the place at the same time, but once the students are in that space, the activity is self-paced. Homework or study are both asynchronous and self-paced, taking place in the environment of the students. And as I was pondering what to do during the pandemic in the beginning, I thought the more I can go from synchronous to asynchronous and from instructor-paced to self-paced, the more time I free up to help students there where it really matters. So this is what I ended up doing. Rather than asking the students to come to my space, which in pre-pandemic times would mean the classroom, and in post-pandemic, or not post-pandemic, pandemic, I should say, times, in the beginning meant students coming to my Zoom room, I decided to have the instructional staff, myself and my assistants, visit every team's individual room. So each team of 4 students, even though this is a class of close to 120 students, would meet together and then occasionally be visited by a member of the instructional staff in their own Zoom room. So rather than feeling like a large lecture-based room, it felt like a small, intimate 4-person classroom. During the pandemic, I had 80 students. I just mentioned 120 because of the success of what happened during the pandemic. I've now been punished with, a 50% increase of the students. Well, I say punished. I mean, of course, it's a compliment that the number increased. I also realized that students get to share their work much more actively. If you sit around a table, it's very hard to share work. Well, you can put a board near the table, but most classrooms aren't equipped that way. But online, it's really easy to share work with each other. Every student sitting on the front row. And you know what is also really, really nice? That little name label there that tells you who the student is. I never got to know my students as well as last year. The last change I made was that I radically changed the approach to assessment, replacing infrequent, high-stakes testing with an approach called specifications grading, which essentially employs digital badges to keep students continuously engaged and accountable. So rather, let's say, than having 3 midterm exams or so, or 5 or whatever number you want, I had 68 little micro units, each of which the students needed to earn a micro badge for. Helping keeping the students continuously engaged in a way that I have never seen before. Let me show you some results very quickly. In the fall semester, so exactly a year ago, the content learning gains doubled. On the right, you see the in-person pre-pandemic course on the left, and on the right, you see the remote online learning gain, double of what I had before. And in the spring, a pretty similar doubling of the gain. Now, that's one thing that is nice, but there are so many other factors that really determine the success of our students. For example, one of it is their self-efficacy, their belief in their ability to be able to succeed in a certain domain, in my case, in physics. These are not physics concentrators. There are students who major in engineering or in pre-med and who are not normally really interested in self-efficacy. And most research in self-efficacy has shown that in lecture-based courses, actually self-efficacy, for non-majors, self-efficacy goes down. I found last year that the gain that I had in my pre-pandemic class, which was actually positive, doubled. It was this new modality that I had implemented during the pandemic. On top of that, we had an improved sense of growth and autonomy. So the self-determination of my students increased dramatically, as well as a sense of support and community. Yes, community, even though we were online rather than in person. And the course evaluation went almost to the maximum of the scale, which is why I now have so many more students than I had last year. Evaluating the results, I think I can state with much confidence that I did my best teaching ever remotely last year. So last summer, well, this year, 2021, as we were suddenly forced back into the classroom, I was thinking, now what? What am I going to do? Am I simply going to revert back to the situation I had before? That would be almost unethical in light of the results that I had. So I decided to actually offer the students a completely multimodal approach. They could either, as you see on the left, choose to attend the class, the team-based class, in person, physically sitting around a table, masked, of course. The picture doesn't show that, but we still have to wear masks inside. Or they could do it on Zoom. Either case, the activity would be the same. And either case, when they need a member of the teaching staff, they call us in digitally, and we join them either physically at the table or virtually in the team Zoom room. My office happens to be pretty close to the classroom, so I essentially go back and forth depending on what modality the team is that I'm going to visit is using. And even when they're around the table, we still use Zoom for them to facilitate the sharing of the material that they're working on. They're not using audio or video because they can see each other and hear each other, but they still use that platform so that everybody can sit facing each other, but also seeing at the screen what is being shared. Now, when I asked at the beginning of the semester, the students what their preferences were in person, doesn't matter, or online, 80-some% indicated that they wanted to be in person. I think there was such a pent-up demand for being back in person in the classroom that hardly anyone, and I was somewhat disappointed by that because I knew the results I'd obtained in the year before, and I couldn't quite visualize it yet, how it would work in the classroom. But something really interesting has happened over the course of the 3 months that I've been teaching now. Here is what happened to the percentage preference, I should say, that the students expressed in being in person. It went from 80-some% in September to 60-some% in October, and then dropped to 40% at the beginning of November, where we are right now. In fact, these data are from yesterday. But what is even more interesting is the actual attendance, which even more heavily skewed towards in-person at the beginning of the term and online at the end, because students are discovering the flexibility. Here's one thing that is really interesting. The teams that are meeting in person are forced to meet within that block of time where the room is available. But the teams that are flexible enough to meet online have another flexibility too, namely time shifting the time at which they meet and call in one of us. Is it more work? No, not at all, because there's a conservation law here. It's the same amount of work no matter when you do it. So going back to this article by Yuval Harari and that paragraph that I read to you in the beginning of my talk here, I think I can state with great confidence right now that remote teaching is probably going to be a certainty for my teaching. Now, in a sense, my approach has started to break down the classroom walls and help set learning free. And that is perhaps one of the most important things in education, as I strongly believe that education should be learner-centered and intrinsically motivated. Thank you so much for your attention.
If you actually have all the showcases and the insights into the practical work, and hence we already have a lot of questions in the chat. Let me just have a look at them. I think Victor asked, for the teams, referencing to the example you had there, did you sort students in the small teams based on certain aspects, or was it random?
No. That's a very good question. Thank you so much for asking. It was certainly not random. It turns out that, self-selected teams are the worst. Because they tend to be not very diverse. They tend to be people of the same opinion. They don't permit people to brainstorm in a very effective way. Random teams are a little bit better than self-selected teams, but we can do much better than that. In fact, Google has a big project on trying to find out how to best team people in the workplace, and we've been talking to them at length. So we diversify students across a number of different dimensions in terms of ability. We want high performance and low performance so that people keep challenging each other. We want people with different majors. We don't want all engineers together or all life scientists together. We want a mix of them. We mix them by gender. In a pretty male-dominated field, such as physics, we don't want a team, let's say, with 3 males and 1 female. So those are a number of the metrics that we use to form the teams. And, we put this all into a linear programming algorithm. And then, in fact, I have to do that this afternoon. After this talk, I have to make the new team formation, because that's one other thing, which I forgot to mention. We have typically 2 or 3 projects per semester. Each is about a month long. And each project is a separate team formation. If 3 or 4 of us have worked together for the first project, I'm guaranteed not to work with the same people on project 2 and project 3. This means I can take what I've learned from my first collaborative experience and improve on that after, because though it involves a peer and self-evaluation, I can improve on that in my next project. So thank you so much for asking that very important question.
There's more questions relating to that. On the one hand, with teams, with 20 teams, how much time did you get to spend with each group and how often?
So there are 29 teams this year, we have a whole matrix where essentially when we keep track of our visits to each team. And when I say we, I say myself and my teaching assistants. So I actually am much more accountable for my time now than I used to be before. Before I would just, wander the classroom and occasionally sit down at the table and join students and then wait for a team to call me. Now, since we have this log, I just am engaged 100% of the time, hopping from one team to another. And I would say I probably spend, let's say 75 minutes times 4. So that's 3 hours visiting team. And I'm engaged 100% of the time.
Mm-hmm. I'm just see that Ulrike said something that references your previous answer, where she just shares that she's also started to rotating people through teams and finds that it works better, even though it is a little bit more work for students. Yes, but coming back to the time question that we just discussed, how do you manage your time actually? Some attendees here in the chat wonder if teams decide spontaneously to move around their slots. How do you keep up with that? And can you offer some flexibility, or is it a rather rigid system?
So maybe I will show our dashboard. I had not counted on doing that, but I'm going to do that. Let's see, but the technicians will have to switch.
Can we share the slides one more time, Lavinia?
Well, it's not the slides. It's really, I'm sharing from my other computer. I'm sort of sharing our dashboard. Good. Okay. So here are the teams, and each of these is a Zoom link that gets managed by the team itself. So in other words, they tell us on a separate sheet that is accessible to them, they can't see this. This is our spreadsheet. And they enter their Zoom links there. And then if we want to join them, we click on that. And this basically copies over the Zoom link from the sheet that they have access to. They also indicate whether they're going to be, they're planning on meeting in person or online. So if it's blank, it's online. If it's peer, if it says the classroom number, we know it's in person. And then here you can see for the various members of the teaching staff how many times each team has been visited. So we can essentially make sure that the different teams are visited at the same time. And here we keep track of their progress. So essentially, this is a team that called us here for the second part of their assignment yesterday. And we ran out of time and didn't get a chance to go over it with them. So we'll do this asynchronously outside. But if we were to click it off, the highlight would go away. So essentially, we manage our time using this dashboard, if you want.
That is interesting. Oh, I can hear a dog in the background, I think. Somebody needs to go for a walk. So let me shorten the questions we have left then. I think because there was a question that had a different topic, let me just scroll through it. Cynthia earlier asked, what measuring tool did you use to measure the self-efficacy gains? For example, class, MPEX, what did you use there?
Oh, very good. People are familiar with both MPEX and class. We actually used a slightly different tool, which was derived from a self-efficacy measurement that was developed by Bandura, who unfortunately recently passed away. And it is published in one of my recent articles on self-efficacy. So if you Google my name and self-efficacy, you can find the instrument. It's related to class, and it has some overlap with both class and MPACS, but it's different.
So Google your name and efficacy test.
Self-efficacy.
Test. Yes. Very last question, a quick answer. Do you also have a concept to virtualize laboratory internships?
I shoved that under the rug. I'm sorry, they're blowing leaves outside now. No, I think that's important to do that in person. And that whole part, the project part, the building, is done in person, you know, in the lab, but it's completely asynchronous. Students can come there whenever they want.
Wonderful, thank you. And I see a lot of appreciation in the chat. I know you can't see it, but people really write, thank you, those were really brilliant insights. And let's maybe close with a little bit of trivia, because it was something that I marveled about with the team here. Nobody did know the answer. I introduced you as the Balkanski Professor of Physics and Applied Physics, and actually that goes back to Minko Balkanski, who's the sponsor of that position, and who, made it possible. So if you were wondering about that as well, this is the answer. You can't see it now, but people have the option to click like and applaud here, and you know, these little emojis, they're floating all over the screen, so people really enjoyed your presentation. Thanks a lot for joining us today, Eric.
Wonderful. Thank you so much.